Apple? Apple. That's fine, dude.
kid that lived across the street from me, and his name was Zachary. And we didn't really like Zachary, okay? He was kind of an asshole. He didn't really fit in with any of the other neighborhood kids. Hey, Zach, who's your favorite Power Ranger? I like Beetleborg. Wow, you're a dumbass. He would be the kid that would always try to kick the football when you're playing catch, even though he couldn't kick worth a damn, and it'd always go in the middle of nowhere. All right, I'm gonna kick it. Don't kick the football. Kick it? No, don't kick it. Okay, I'm kicking it. God damn it. And the kid would never swear. He wouldn't curse, he wouldn't do anything, which is good, I suppose. But it was the complete opposite for us. We'd be standing there like, man, I was up all fucking night playing Punch-Out on the fucking Nintendo, and I couldn't get past that punk-ass bitch piston Honda. Motherfucker knocked my ass down 7 fucking times last night. Fucking bitch. Yeah. But one day, my buddy Tommy and I decided to go over Zachary's house just to see how the other side lived. So we go in his house and we meet his mom, and the entire time I'm looking at all these pictures up on the wall. And they're pictures of Zach and his family on vacation and doing a bunch of cool shit. Whoa, Zach, you were on an episode of Saved by the Bell? His name is Zachary, Tyler, not Zach, okay? Call him Zachary. What the fuck, Zachary? What the hell? What am I, his grandmother calling him by his full name and shit? Yeah, whatever, weirdo. Then you can't call me Tyler, okay? Call me by my full name. Tylandosaurus Rex. You got it? Tylandosaurus Rex, Jr. That's my Christian name. So we go upstairs to look at his room, and he opens the door, and I swear to God, his goddamn bedroom is the best bedroom I've ever seen in my childhood life. This dude had, like, every video game console known to man. Here I am playing the same crusty-ass Nintendo my entire life, and this dude's got a fucking PlayStation 4 in 1999, and he's got Pokemon cards coming out of every crevice in his room, cards I've never even seen in my life. Whoa, dude, you got a Gary Coleman mon? This dude's bedroom made Chuck E. Cheese look like a fucking meth lab in Kentucky. Me and Tommy are standing there, we can't believe our eyes. It's like the scene in Willy Wonka where the kids see the chocolate factory for the first time. Come with me, and you'll be in a world of your imagination.
Homosexuality. Homosexuality.
It was the best day of my life. And then Zachary comes up to us, and he's like, well, what do you guys want to do? You guys want to wrestle? Hell yeah, we'll wrestle your dumb ass. I'll be the Undertaker. I'm going to be so cold. I want to be Perry Saturn. What? Perry Saturn? Who the hell wants to be Perry Saturn? Not even Perry Saturn wants to be Perry Saturn. Zach, what the hell's the matter with you? But we let it slide, and we all start wrestling, and things are going well. But then all of a sudden, something starts to smell like pee. And then I look at Zach's pants, and something looks like pee. Dude, you peed your pants. No, I didn't. Yeah, you did. You're swimming in piss right now. I'll be right back. And he just waddles off like it's no big deal. And I'm like, Tommy, what the fuck was that all about? Dude peed his pants. This is pretty fucking weird, dude. We should probably leave before he comes back in here and shits on the floor. And that's what we did. We just left. Walked right past his mom and everything. Hey, where you going, Tylandosaurus Rex Jr.? Your son pisses his pants, Debbie. We're out of here. We've had enough of this circus show. And that was it. We never went over there again. That was the kid across the street for you. And if you're sitting there like, I don't remember any kid like that growing up, well, you probably were the fucking kid across the street. With your Beetleborg-loving, football-kicking ass. BruceDude.com.
Let's talk about easy. Like fee-free easy. And no minimum fee. Plus, it earns interest. Like possibly getting paid up to 2 days sooner easy.
So, it's the early 20th century. Photography's been a thing for a while now, and simple cameras are flooding the consumer market. So far, though, these cameras aren't capturing color. Oh, sure, discovering a light-sensitive material, incorporating it onto a flexible substrate, and commercializing production and development processes at scale to create a simple, easy, and at least relatively inexpensive way to capture moments in time is pretty dang impressive. But the world isn't black and white. It wouldn't be too long, though, until photography got a little more colorful. This is an autochrome plate. one of the earliest commercially successful color photography processes, and it is fascinating in its simplicity, especially given how detailed the images can be. Believe it or not, this is in fact nothing more than an ordinary black and white photograph. Okay, well obviously that's not true. What I mean is, the chemistry used to produce the plate and to develop the image is largely the exact same silver gelatin process we've explored in previous videos. The only meaningful difference is a reversal step which creates a positive image on the plate. So, where does the color come from? You probably figured it out by now. It's potato starch, obviously. Let's back up for a moment. Longtime viewers of the channel may remember the names Thomas Young and Hermann von Helmholtz from my video on analog color television. These two fellas got their names on a theory for color vision, which, wouldn't you know it, was mostly correct. Back in 1802, Young was like, our eyes, they probably have like 3 different color receptors in them. And then, like 48 years later, Helmholtz was like, yeah, and I bet one group probably prefers shorter wavelengths, another more medium wavelengths, and the third, the long one. And blam, we had color vision figured out. Then, this Scottish guy, James Clerk Maxwell, thought that maybe we could make use of that knowledge with these camera thingies. Maxwell reasoned that if a camera could be made selectively sensitive, we could reproduce color by capturing 3 images, which were each composed only of the theorized wavelength ranges. And we could make this selective sensitivity happen with simple color filters. Putting a red filter over the lens would only allow long wavelengths through to the photographic plate. A green filter would only allow medium wavelengths to pass. And blue, dabba dee dabba die, would only allow the shorter wavelengths through. The resulting photograph would be black and white, but Maxwell thought that if they were then tinted to match the captured wavelengths, so red, green, and blue, and then recombined through means of projection on a screen, we would be able to reproduce the true colors of the originally captured image. He had this brainstorm in 1855 and didn't do anything about it for 6 years. Then, in 1861, Maxwell finally put his idea into practice by hiring someone else to do it for him. That someone else was photographer Thomas Sutton, who took 3 pictures of the same subject, one each through a red, green, and blue filter, and then made positive copies of these pictures. He tinted them red, green, and blue to match the original exposures, and handed them over to Maxwell, where he would wow the Royal Institution with his amazing color photograph. And this is it. This is a ribbon made of tartan. Think kilt, but bow. And you may notice that the color is barely there. That's because this barely worked. The photographic chemistry available in 1861 was not panchromatic, so it was mainly sensitive to blue light. Capturing other wavelengths took much more exposure time, especially red. But this proof of concept worked, and when panchromatic emulsions photographers went through this painstaking process, such as survey pictures of Gordon. These photographs of his are all from 1910 or earlier. It's amazing how good these were, although it should be noted that these are all digitally created photography. It's possible that in their time, these were never used with the fidelity we are using now. This image is presented alongside the original monochrome. Compare them, and you can see how different colors appear at different brightnesses. Top to bottom, the exposures were filtered through blue, green, and red. So, by the turn of the 20th century, we had a working theory of color vision which had successfully been applied to the photographic process. This filtered exposure method is matter of fact, Technicolor motion pictures use a very similar technique. The three-strip Technicolor process is pretty much the exact method which produces this image, and this saw use in the 1950s. I skipped forward in time by bringing up Technicolor, but as it happens, the Autochrome Plate has a strong connection to the world of the movies. Its full name is actually Autochrome Lumiere, as this method was invented by the Lumiere team. These pioneering French fellas found fame and fortune filming sights, such as the arrival of a train at La Ciotat station. You know, this little clip, that was shot in 1895. The Lumiere brothers started out their business ventures producing still photographic plates, but their foray into moving pictures brought many developments that would bring that industry from its infancy into, like, a real thing. However, they grew bored of it and thought the cinema had no future. This goes to show that being good at inventing stuff doesn't necessarily give you a good sense of how the future will go. Anyway, they had been playing around with color photography for some time, experimenting with various techniques such as the Latent Plate, which is its own fascinating thing and which I highly suggest you check out. However, that was wildly impractical, and so they kept playing around until they landed on this. These are an amazingly simple method by which to capture a full color image. They utilize the same color filtering technique of chromoscope and Technicolor, but incorporated onto a single plate, which could be used in any camera, processed with ordinary chemicals, and which revealed the full color image entirely on. They patented this method in 1903, and it hit the market in 1907. Before I get into how it works, I need to give a huge thank you to patron of the channel, John Hilton. John loaned me these plates, and is among the cool folks out there who are making their own Autochrome plates today. And it's thanks to his knowledge and experimentation that I can share the process with you so completely. John also creates photographs using other ancient techniques, including Daguerreotypes. I put links to his Instagram in the description, as well as to his excellent website, which includes the Autochrome guide that you can bet I referenced heavily. The Lumiere brothers knew that a color image could be captured through 3 filtered exposures and presented by recombining them. The genius of the Autochrome Plate is the fact that it contains and displays all 3 filtered exposures at once. Take a close look at this plate. See how the solid areas appear sort of shimmery? Let's look closer. That sure looks like a mosaic of red, green, and blue, doesn't it? That's because it is. Well, actually, it's more like blue, violet, green, and red, orange, but it works much the same. What you are looking at are tiny, practically microscopic blobs of dyed potato starch. Scatter them randomly on top of a black and white image, and you get a color one. Well, wait a minute. Randomly? That can't work. Actually, it can. See, this very plate is what was inside the camera when the image was taken. A random distribution of color dots doesn't matter. quite the genius of the Autochrome. The mosaic of colored dots is integral to the plate, present from exposure to viewing. It's astoundingly simple, yet works remarkably well. Would you like to know how this is done? Well, I hope so, because I'm about to tell you. These vials contain dyed potato starch. These 3 powders are all that's necessary to turn your drab,
by a man named in the 1970s. Its main business was the processing and supply of chicken products to other companies, including
retailers. Rowe owns several facilities, with the factory in Hamlet being acquired in 1980 to add to his growing portfolio. This particular plant would be managed by Emmett's son, Brad Rowe. His factory had been sitting empty for a while. It had started life as the Mellow Buttercup ice cream plant, but was ideally situated to be turned into a chicken processing facility. Standing in the town of Hamlet in North Carolina, the plant was geographically close to both suppliers of chicken and distributors of chicken products. Not only that, but labor in the area was cheap, as there was a serious shortage of jobs. Once acquired by Imperial Food Products, the building was renovated extensively, and quickly became the home of one of the largest employers in the area. Even from the very beginning, though, there were a lot of problems at the plant. The Rowes never applied for many of the licenses required to run the business, as doing so would have cost a great deal of money and caused them to be subject to surprise inspections by the state. The plant was accused of contaminating the town's water supply with chicken grease, and furthermore, suffered several small fires in 1980, 1983, and 1987. One of these fires disabled the sprinkler system that had been put in place by the previous tenant of the building. It was not replaced. For any other business, this persistent refusal to comply with licensing and safety regulations might have resulted in an investigation, a massive fine, and perhaps further legal consequences to the responsible parties. However, in the case of the Imperial Food Products plant in Hamlet, the Rowes were able to get away with an extraordinary amount of non-compliance for one simple reason. The factory was a vital employer to the town and contributed hugely to its economy. Should anything cause the factory to close or relocate, it would be devastating to the people of Hamlet. For this reason, officials often turned a blind eye, an attitude they later described as benign neglect. In the days leading up to the disaster, workers at the Hamlet plant made some repairs to a leaking hydraulic line on one of the machines. The head mechanic had requested a brand new replacement line, but was told by the Rowes that it would be too expensive and to use a spare part instead. Workers fitted the spare line, but were unhappy with the result. The line was too long and presented a trip hazard. To tidy up their work, they sliced the line into a saw and used an improvised connector to shorten it. It's worth noting that this was all done while the plant was fully operational. It was standard practice to do so, as closing down the production line could be extremely costly. Many workers did so, risking losing their jobs.
Fresh, I'm with Venture Off-Road. I'm here at Huntington Beach today. This is my new Jeep Gladiator I just got literally about a month or so ago. Guys are here today from Banks to put a tuner in this. We don't make any products. We're not tied to any brand. We can use the best products in the industry, and that's why Banks is here.
As soon as the repair was made, then the machine was put back into use. It was around 8:15 a.m., and there were approximately 90 staff members on site at this point in time. As soon as the line was put back into action, the improvised connector failed. The hose snapped, spraying flammable hydraulic fluid across the room. On contact with the heating element of a cooker, this fluid ignited, and a fire spread rapidly through the factory. There was plenty of fuel for this fire. Many surfaces in the factory.
Alright, ever since I was a kid, I'd get random nosebleeds. Didn't matter where I was at the time, in the middle of class, on an airplane, taking a shit at my grandpa's house, you name it. It would just happen randomly. I'd have no control over it. And if I was at home, it was no big deal. You just fashion yourself a little nose tampon out of toilet paper and you go about your day. But what the fuck do you do when you get a nosebleed at a public pool? Panic. That's what you do. Probably the worst possible place you can get a nosebleed, except maybe like a church, like at a baptism or something. It's the devil! So I'm at the pool with my cousin, and we're all amped up, and we're about to jump in. So I do this sweet Axel from the Streets of Rage jump kick in the pool, and when I rise to the top, blood just starts gushing out of my nose. This is a spontaneous nosebleed in the middle of a fucking public pool. Jesus Christ, I'd rather shit in the pool than bleed in it. I'd rather spell my name out in turds in the pool than get a nosebleed. Everybody's rushing out of the pool like the water's on fire. I climb out of the side all lightheaded and shit. Somebody kill me! I need a fucking blood transfusion. I'm O positive. Oh, God. If I die at this pool, somebody's got to take care of my Tamagotchi I got at home. Then this dude comes out of the middle of nowhere and smashes like 50 napkins in my face. What happened? You get shot in the face? I think somebody shot him in the face. He has AIDS? On a scale of 1 to 10, how much AIDS do you have? The whole pool is totally evacuated at this point. I got some hazmat people from ET coming in. I'm half conscious. The pool looks like the beaches of Normandy. Everybody's against it. Like, oh, come on. There's chlorine in a pool. Jesus Christ, I pissed in the pool a couple weeks ago. Nobody even cared. Now there's a couple of quarts of human blood in there, and everybody wants to freak out. Never went back to that pool after that. I don't think I was welcome. They're like, whoa, buddy, I know we're a public pool and all, but we have to have some kind of fucking standard. You can piss in there, maybe even a half a shit, but we're not doing any nasty nose blood. We don't want hepatitis, all right?
BruceDude.com.
On our quick check drive makes it much easier to sell to the consumer. For anybody to be able to generate an additional 200 plus grand on an average for a year is definitely going to be a settlement.
All right, now most of you know that my neighbor Michael was a pretty big wuss. But nobody could make Michael look more like a wuss than a girl that lived on our street named Bethany. Now nobody liked Bethany all that much because, for one, her name was Bethany, and that's a terrible name. It's not even a real name. That's more like a sound effect when you throw them all over the place. Bethany. Oh, what the fuck? And for two, Bethany was a genuinely unpleasant person to be around. She'd go around giving people wet willies and shit. You have to be a one sick bastard to be licking your fingers and sticking them in other people's ears. And Bethany was that sick bastard. Now, poor little Michael was always Bethany's favorite target. So she would torment the shit out of him any chance she got. He'd be hanging out in Michael's driveway. He'd be drinking a glass of milk, minding his own business. All of a sudden, here comes Bethany in her stupid-ass Pocahontas hat that she always wore. Why are you drinking a glass of milk? It's 94 degrees out here. Because I like milk? Well, that was the wrong answer, according to Bethany. She just headbutts Michael right in the nose like a bouncer at a nightclub. Michael's on the ground. His milk explodes on the pavement. God damn it, Michael! I don't bust my ass 26 hours a week at Home Depot for you to be wasting milk all willy-nilly. Get in here, you're getting 10 across the ass. And Bethany did this all the time because she's apparently got the hardest head in the world. She can smash a diamond with that goddamn melon of hers. Now, on one particular day, we're out there screwing around in Michael's driveway again because, well, that's what you do when you're poor, is you screw around in other people's driveway. And here comes Bethany, and she looks all pissed off. Even the Pocahontas on her hat has a shitty look on her face. Michael can't even get a word in before she headbutts him like a bad guy in Walker, Texas Ranger. His ass goes flying backwards. He smashes through the glass on the side door of his house. God damn it, Michael! Why do you keep breaking shit like an autistic kid? Bethany did it. She headbutted me. I don't care who did it. You're still getting 10 across the ass for getting beat up by a girl. Get your ass in here. Now, this was the last straw for Michael. He was sick of being the butt of everybody's jokes. Hey, Michael, go get me an RC Cola from your house before I have Bethany come over here and whoop your ass again. So a few days go by. We're walking down the street, and Michael sees his opportunity for revenge. We're out front of Bethany's house, and sitting on her porch is that goddamn Pocahontas hat that she always wears. I think I have an idea. He takes the hat, and he disappears for a good 30 seconds. He comes back with this big old smile on his face. Michael, what the hell did you do to her hat? Who, me? Nothing. Oh, I mean, I pissed all over it, if that's what you're asking. You did what? Yeah, I peed all over it. What do you want me to do? She keeps headbutting me like a Dudley boy. I'm sick of it. Michael puts it back on her porch like nothing ever happened, and sure as hell, the next day goes by, and Bethany's wearing that pissy Pocahontas hat. And she's not just wearing it, she's sporting it like a fashion statement. Yeah, I'm wearing this piss stain hat on my head. What's the big deal? There's flies buzzing around her head and shit. Jesus Christ, Michael, she's gonna get headlights or something. Who's gonna get headlights? Michael's over there trying not to piss himself. What's so goddamn funny? Well, I peed all over your Pocahontas hat yesterday. That's what's funny. Well, if that didn't wipe the smirk off of Bethany's hard-ass head. See, you know to think it first. No, you didn't. Yeah, I did. I peed all over that thing. Did he really? I don't know, Bethany. Michael's a sick little bastard. He probably did. She just stood there and thought for a second. No, you didn't. Then she just walked off. Now, I don't know if Bethany was just in denial good if somebody's gonna piss all over your stuff. Well, that was easy. Yeah, I guess it was. Hey, you never pissed on any of my stuff, did you, Michael?
BruceDude.com.
Oh.
Google Fi, a phone stand by Google. Save big on the new Samsung Galaxy S22 series. With ultra-bright display, better than ever design, and a battery that can go all day. Switch to Fi and start saving today.
Educators are heroes, and even heroes need protection. We're California Casualty, a national insurance company that provides auto and home insurance for heroes. We've been around for over a century.
All right. I loved Halloween. You get to put on a costume, have strange men throw candy at you. It's not the look. You sitting there at school, just waiting to get out of class so you can go trick-or-treating. I'm going to eat so much candy tonight, I'm going to be diabetic by tomorrow morning. After school, all my friends would meet up at Michael's house. Michael's stepdad would be sitting there talking shit about our costumes. What the hell are you supposed to be? Johnny Depp? Johnny Depp? No, I'm a goddamn vampire. Oh, what about your stupid friend there? What is he, some kind of cowboy pimp? No. I'm the Macho Man, Randy Savage. All of a sudden, Michael walks in all dressed up. You guys like my sweet Montel Williams costume? God damn it, Michael. You've been Montel Williams the past 3 years. Get a new costume already. I'm not buying a new costume every year. What do I look like? I'm made of money? Besides, he likes being Montel Williams, don't you, Michael? Yeah, I'm a talk show host. Who wants a paternity test? We head off to go trick-or-treating. My friend Steven looks like an idiot because it's 1997, and every goddamn kid in the neighborhood was a Scream Mask that year. Now, all of us had one goal in mind, and that was to get as much candy as possible. And Michael had the best strategy for getting the most candy. He'd go up to a house and he'd be like, trick or treat! Oh, today's my birthday too! Oh, well, happy birthday! You get an extra piece of candy with your cute little Steve Harvey costume. Michael, what the hell? Your birthday's in August. Yeah, so what? If you lie to people, they give you more candy. So every house we went up to, Michael would just make something up. Trick or treat! I'm not stupid! Oh, shit, what the fuck? What? Are you serious? Yeah, right, I'm serious. Suck that tag. 50% of your candy. Don't be a baby. I left you all the good stuff anyway.
Buying digital assets on Ntsc is simple, intuitive, and only takes a few clicks. Just open the Ntsc mobile app and tap on the Fund Your Account button on the dashboard. From there, select your preferred deposit method, credit or debit card, bank transfer, or topping up from an external wallet. Want to purchase securely in seconds? Then we suggest you choose our Buy with Card functionality. Once you tap on Credit Debit Card, simply select your desired asset. Enter the cash amount you'd like to spend and tap Continue. Then enter the details of your MasterCard or Visa and tap Validate Card. You can rest assured that the information you entered is securely processed by our trusted provider. Right before you're done, you'll see a detailed breakdown of the amount you'll receive. When you're ready, tap Buy and you're all set.
what's missing now, huh? I'm hungry. Okay, Baba. Off. Come on. Time to you to get off. Get off of me, please. Come on. Up and away. There. Well, then guess what? What? Good job! Good job! I forget. Perfect clutch engagement and perfect gear shift. First, second, third, fourth, fifth. little bit of rev hang on the third gear. That's a bigger thing it forced me to. go. Oh shit. I did not get me my what? What? Alright. Come on, move it, man. No, not doing that with you right now. Fuck, man, that's still free gas. Are you kidding me? dude. I'm like, what am I? You can just drive down here from his house. It's easy. Put the to get gas. You know, if I live around here. I can't make that down.
Google Fi, a phone plan by Google. With our Unlimited Plus plan, you'll get unlimited data, hotspot tethering, and international data.
Arr.
Alright, now a lot of you may know that I grew up next door to a kid named Michael. And a lot of you may know that he was a big wussy crybaby, and I wasn't his biggest fan. But Michael didn't always live next door to me. Before he moved in, there was another kid that lived next door named TJ. Now, TJ was a couple years older than me, and he was cool as hell. I mean, his name is just a couple of letters, for Christ's sake. You have to be cool as hell if your name's just a couple of letters. And when I say this kid was cool, I mean he had like a Vanilla Ice poster on his bedroom wall. He had like every Nintendo game known to man. And to my little kid ass, that's what was cool back then. So needless to say, I was always trying to go over to his house. Now, I remember one time in particular, I called him on the telephone one day to see if I could come over, but nobody answered because he wasn't home. So what did I do? Well, I called his ass like 4 times. That's what I did. I was a little ass kid. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. His parents came home later that day like, what the hell, Barbara? You have 47 messages on our answering machine? Hey, get next door. Can I come over and play Nintendo? Hey, it's me again. Can I come over and look at your Vanilla Ice poster? Hey, it's kid next door. I guess you're not home, so I guess I'll call back in 5 seconds. Hey, it's kid next door. Hey, it's me again. I know you're in there, goddammit. The next day, my dad comes in my room like, hey, can you not call the neighbor's house 4 dozen times like you're some kind of psycho ex-girlfriend? They're gonna file a restraining order against your goofy ass. What the hell's the matter with you? So needless to say, it was pretty depressing when TJ moved out and dumbass Michael moved in next door. Hell, I remember the first time I'd seen Michael. My friend David and I were looking out the window and we seen some kid wearing a Scottie Pippen jersey just digging in his ass crack. Oh, that's cool. That's the new neighbor. It's like I gotta live next to an ass picker for the rest of my life. Fantastic. So we walk out there to introduce ourselves. Hey, my name's Michael. Do you guys want to play with me? I got this broken...
am all out of weed. I'm all out of work, sir. Hiya, big girl. Oh, he's my purring kitten, huh? He's my big purring girl, huh? He's my big purring girl, huh? Ooh, you only purr when you're hungry. Are you really hungry? Are you seriously hungry? Are you hungry? Aww. You can have any brew you want, as long as it is good run. Oh man.
Squirt gun we can play with? Yeah, I guess. You don't happen to have like a Nintendo or something, do you? No, my stepdad sold it so you can buy more natty lights. I got a paint roller upstairs though. A paint roller? What the hell's the matter with this kid? How about we just play baseball instead? So we start playing baseball in the street. Michael's stepdad is yelling at us from the house. Hey Michael, where's your piggy bank at? I need to go get a pack of Marlboro Reds. Hey, you better not break a window out there or you're gonna get 10 across the axe. Now, after a few minutes of playing baseball, we quickly found out that Michael wasn't the brightest kid on the block. For one, he was easily distracted. I mean, the kid had a simple brain. There wasn't much going on up there. It was just like a fucking dial tone droning on in his head. All right, Michael, I'm ready. Throw the ball. Michael? Hello? Are you listening?
If you'd like to make a call, please hang up and try again.
God damn it, Michael, what are you staring at? I'm looking at those squirrels rustling up in that tree. We look across the street, and there is a couple of squirrels in the tree, but they're not wrestling. They're doing something much more R-rated, much more intimate, if you will. The squirrels were fucking, is what I'm saying. They were fucking. Michael, I don't think those squirrels are wrestling. Michael? God damn it, Michael, would you pay attention? You dare me to huck this baseball at him? Michael, I don't think that's a good... Holy hell! Michael, you throw like a goddamn girl! So Michael totally obliterates this truck's window. The car alarm starts blaring throughout the neighborhood, making all those weird sound effects and shit. What the hell did you hit, Michael? A goddamn spaceship? Hey, what did you do to my truck? You better believe your little Scotty Pippen ass is paying for that. What the hell's going on out here? Your son is vandalizing cars all willy-nilly. That's what's going on. No, I was just trying to hit those squirrels that are wrestling. Whoa, wait a minute. First off, asshole, that's not my son. That's my stepson. Second off, those squirrels are fucking, not wrestling. And third off, Michael, get in here. You're getting 10 across the ass.
Joe Simon. Go over there and come on. Come on, fatty, you always do this. Stop putting your ass on... How do you even sit there, dude? Like, what the fuck? That shit was up your ass crack, man. What the fuck? You're the weirdest cat I've ever seen, man. Come on. There.
Get workers' compensation insurance in 10 minutes or less with Ntsc, because there's no time to waste when you're running a small business. Workers...
Alright, now when you're a kid in school, there was nothing better than going on a field trip. And out of all the field trips that I had as a kid, a local bowling alley was probably my favorite. Now, why was it my favorite? Because it was totally uneducational, that's why. We played the art museum for Christ's sake, and it was a dirty-ass bowling alley. You're gonna eat nachos, and then you're gonna bowl a sorry-ass 29 in 10th grade. You're not gonna learn anything. Now, when we would do field trips in my school, we would be put into groups, and then parents would Stop shouting about your giant asshole, please. You're freaking out the whole goddamn bowling alley. What the hell's the matter with you? After a couple of hours.
You Jenna. There's no gelato, like gelato, but no gelato. That shit is good though.
In the 1960s, the increase in air traffic was causing a problem for the once dominant railways. It was becoming easier to fly long distances by air and much faster than any train could match. However, on the shorter routes of a few hundred kilometres between major population centres, trains could compete on a more level playing field. Stations were usually in the centre of populated areas, and the trains were also quicker and easier to get on and off compared to an aircraft at out-of-town airports. The problems the railways had was that the trains themselves were not very fast, and they were usually limited by the tracks which often dated to the beginning of the 20th century. In the UK, studies into the increase in passengers due to the introduction of the Celsius engines on the East Coast main line concluded that for every 1 mile an hour increase in speed, there was a 1% increase in passenger numbers. Normally, if you want to go faster, the curb sections start to be an issue and limit the speed. In some circumstances, the track itself was pulled back as this was expensive to build and maintain. It also wasn't suitable for some heavy freight trains, so it was found that a maximum amount of fat from mixed traffic was around about 6.5 degrees. Passenger trains travelling around flat curved paths were less of a problem, so long as they weren't travelling so fast that they might come off the rails, but it was more down to passenger comfort. Going fast around a flat curve generates a sensitive repulsion. The train and everything inside it pushes the passengers outwards, making it uncomfortable to sit, difficult to walk, and any loose items often placed on a table will be thrown outwards. To combat this, a tilting carriage system was developed. Now, whilst Talgo of Spain is normally thought of as the leaders and inventors of the tilting trains in the 1950s, the first tilting rail car was an American engine car built by the Pacific Railway Equipment Company in 1937. This was heavily influenced by aviation engineering, with the designer coming from Caltech and 2 other engineers from Northrop Aircraft. The carriage
without the dinner plated glass tables. The result was that it could run smoother and could negotiate corners 20% faster. 3 were built and used by different railways, but with the start of the Second World War, development was halted and their use beyond that was not followed up. However, there are issues with this pendulum method, as there is a delay between the onset of the curve and reaching the proper tilt angle naturally. The carriage tilt angle would overshoot and oscillate as the natural peak force reached before settling down. On slow-moving, sharper turns, such as negotiating multiple points or changing tracks, the swaying from side to side would be quite disconcerting. Roll on to the 1950s and the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway carried out studies into a curving train using a second-generation cargo suspension system which attempted to iron out these previous issues. These used a single axle bogie between the rail cars, the cars themselves sat lower than normal, suspended from an A-frame centered on the bogie with a pivot near the top so they could swing outwards. The link cars separated easily like normal rail cars, so the train would be made up of 3, 5 or 7 cars, plus a diesel power car at each end, one pulling and one pushing. This also removed the need to turn the train around. The power cars had 2 diesel engines, one on either side of the car, with a steady sway in between them, and a control pod above where the crew operated the train from. At the end of the power car, there was doors behind the control section. This allowed the trains to be coupled together to make one long train, so the passengers could walk from one end to the other. The development of the train went on until the 1960s, which coincided with the high-speed ground transportation Act of 65, and the Department of Transportation looking at including high-speed rail services.
Master Bango. Master Bango.
High-speed rail business, the United Aircraft Corporation, UAC, bought the patent for Chesapeake and Ohio trains to take passengers.
How about this? I scream in your fucking ear, and I'll ask you, why not?
One was built by Obscura in Chicago, more than 50 UAC
Dumbass.
studied by their engineers. The biggest change UAC had done to the design was to replace the diesel engines in power cars with gas turbines to decrease the weight. This is where the new turbo train name came from. These aircraft manufacturers, they used the turboprop gas turbine engine 6, a modified version of the Pratt-Whitney Ntsc. This was derated when it saw 500 horsepower to around 300 horsepower, but
Dude, I'm Charles Mann, and here's an offshoot about my channel. That's your company. Now, let me with no honor, I'm so proud of this book. It's so crazy. Everyone, all 100,000 to watch this first off. So I was trying to think of something that would be really cool and actually better than a free book. Here's the plan. You guys go purchase it. Go to Amazon, professional.com, buy the book for $45. Send us
On the 29th of October, 1998, a fire began inside a community centre in Gothenburg, Sweden. That night, the venue was supposedly hosting a birthday party for around 50 people. But when the fire service arrived on scene, they were confronted by an unexpected and horrifying reality. The building was packed with more than 4 times that number, many of whom were already beyond saving. The venue where the fire took place was owned by the Massachusetts Association, a cultural organization which serves the Swedish immigrant community. They rented it out for events like birthdays, dances, and community meetings. The space was a modest one. It occupied the upper floor of a 2-story building that was shared with several other tenants, including a furniture store and a small theatre. The main hall was supplemented by one small kitchen, a coat room, an office, and a storage area. It was accessed by a stairwell at one end, with another stairwell at the other end to serve as an emergency exit. On the 29th of October 1998, the whole space had been rented out by a group of young people for a private party, ostensibly a birthday celebration. The Macedonian Association were assured that it would be a quiet affair, with a maximum of 50 people in attendance, all of them friends or family. It wasn't a ticketed event, they were told. It wouldn't be open to the general public. Because they were expecting a small, privately organised gathering, the Macedonian Association were happy to rent out their space, and weren't required to make any special safety arrangements, or notify the local fire service. Unfortunately, the Macedonian Association had been misinformed. There was just one or two available on demand. Taxi drivers and local bus drivers volunteered their services to transport the Despite all these difficulties, rescue made a real and significant difference, helping at least 70 people out of the building, treating hundreds to their injuries. In total, however, 53 young people died in this disaster, and a further 213 were injured. Investigation was and it was quickly discovered that the cause of the fire was arson. Someone had deliberately set fire to a chair in the fire exit stairwell. The flames had fed on the other furniture piled up, filling the entire stairwell with smoke. When the door to the main hall was opened, fresh combustion fed the flames.
An all-seeing brutally. Nothing that would make it electrically conductive. I didn't touch children.
Let's drop one more name.
The iconoscope design was immensely improved by accident in 1931, when Sandford Essig left one of the microscopes in the oven too long. This broke up the silver layer into tiny globules, which was responsible for increasing the resolution the iconoscope could detect immensely. Therefore, a sharper image was produced. So, don't forget about this. Although the iconoscope was able to reproduce a fine grain, it still wasn't that great. The images were noisy, so blurry, and never found a lot of light, though far less than the other two I tested. RCA was developed to create orthochrome in the 1940s.
Aww, I hate you.
The image orthochrome cube combined principles from the iconoscope, image dissector, and the original orthochrome. The orthochrome cube, along with the European CCF Emicron cube, contained this is complicated.
Quiet gathering, but instead a Halloween dance party organized for high school students. Flyers were posted across the city of the event, open to anyone around high school age who was willing to pay the entry fee. The official capacity of the venue was 150. That night, at least 375 children and young adults turned up. To make the venue ready for this crowd, the organizers had to festoon the plaster walls with painted decorations and set up a small stage to accommodate a DJ and lighting. To create some atmosphere, they set up a rented smoke machine and also covered some of the lights with cardboard to dim. Any furniture that could be moved was piled up against it, or stowed in the fire exit stairwell to leave as much space on the dance floor as possible. Despite the attempts to create more room, the venue ended up packed. As night fell and more youth filtered in, some attendees claimed that the crowd was so tight that they could barely move around, let alone dance. It was shortly before midnight when the DJ opened the door to the fire exit stairwell and was surprised to find that it was full of smoke. The smoke now rolled into the packed dance hall. Reeling back, he jumped on stage, grabbed his microphone and announced that there was a fire in the building and that people should start evacuating. Many of the attendees were confused. Some could smell smoke, but assumed it was either the smoke machine, someone lit a cigarette in a corner somewhere, or one of the cardboard-covered lights overheated. Even those who did decide to evacuate weren't sure where to go. Half of them surged towards the door they had entered by, while half moved in the other direction, towards the fire exit, which was, unfortunately, blocked by smoke and flames. Meanwhile, smoke was pouring into the room. It was shortly followed by flames. As the stage was consumed and lights began to explode, the crowd started moving with a single purpose, flowing in a terrified mass towards the main entrance. As young, panicking partygoers scrambled to escape, the narrow door quickly became congested. As people lost their footing in the crush, the exit became packed with bodies, leaving no means of escape. The DJ, along with several partygoers, realized that they wouldn't be able to get out through either exit. Desperate to get away from the billowing smoke, they broke windows and clambered out through them, dropping to the ground below. Although only one floor up, this was a difficult feat. The building had originally been a factory, so the windows that existed were high up and narrow. To escape through one, the young partygoers would have had to climb around 2 meters, or 6.5 feet, to reach the window, force it open, then roll sideways through the gap. If they managed that, they would still have to brace themselves for a fall of 5 meters, or 16.5 feet.
Dirt.
Re-entered the building itself, lots of firefighters delayed by the wet. Others, distraught by what they had experienced, turned on their rescue. One firefighter recalled being confronted by a group of youth after explaining to them that it could not help the bracelet they were carrying because that friend was already dead. Because of the sheer number of injuries, there were barely enough ambulances to take the injured to hospital. Several young people were forced to ride in easy emergency vehicles, monitored by a single paramedic, taking it in turns to breathe.
Before Baird had even demonstrated his mechanical television, Farnsworth theorized a way to electronically convert an image into a transmittable electrical signal in 1921. This is part of why he's often regarded as television's inventor. He was what you might call a prodigy, as in 1921 he was only 15. He grew up on a Utah farm, and the story goes that he came up with his idea after observing the lines drawn in the field from a plow, realizing that by altering a line as it's drawn over a distance, you can make an image from a field of lines. Perhaps this is why, to this day, each half of an interlaced frame of video is called a field. Farnsworth submitted a patent application in January of 1926. Over a distance, you can make an image from a field of lines. Perhaps this is why, to this day, each half of an interlaced frame of video is called a field. Farnsworth submitted a patent application in January of 1927. However, Farnsworth wasn't the only person trying to build an image dissector. In fact, the invention of television is very complicated, and to say that one person invented it is rather simplistic. For example, before Farnsworth had his image dissector worked out, German professor Max Diekmann and his student Rudolf Karl applied for a patent for this in 1925. In fact, Diekmann was among the first to demonstrate the display capability of the cathode ray tube back in 1906. And in the following year, a Russian scientist named Boris Rosen used a CRT with experimental video signals to create geometric shapes. See, there was a whole lot of experimentation going on all over the world. The Wikipedia entry on the history of television, which is linked in the description, goes over this in much greater detail. Hell and Diekmann's patent was granted to them in October of 1927, but they were never able to produce a working model. Meanwhile, Farnsworth transmitted the first image with his image dissector at his laboratory in San Francisco on September the 7th, 1927. Farnsworth's invention was very crude at this point, as it only really transmitted a line, and not a whole screen of an image. However, it was a revolutionary proof of concept. On September the 3rd, 1928, Farnsworth called a press conference where he declared, "Good news, everyone! I've invented television." His demonstration of actually functional electronic television is generally accepted as the first, and it is for this reason that he's often given credit as the inventor of television. Farnsworth's image dissector was a vacuum tube much like a CRT, but instead of emitting light, the image dissector was meant to detect it. Inside the tube was a coating of cesium oxide, a photosensitive material. Cesium oxide has an interesting characteristic where when photons hit it, it emits electrons. This meant that an image focused with a lens onto the face of an image dissector would create a pattern of electron emissions in the shape and intensity of the image itself. Then this electron image would be scanned. An electron beam, very much like that which would be used to draw an image on the face of a CRT television receiver, would methodically scan the face of the image dissector. Now, as we all know, opposites attract and likes repel. Electrons really don't like to hang out together. What happens when the electron beam encounters the area of the image dissector where bright light is hitting the surface? Well, the cesium oxide coating is itself producing electrons, so the electron beam would bounce back at areas where light was already present. Ordinarily, most of the beam would just be absorbed by the oxide coating or even the tube's glass, but any electron sent by the gun that ran into a spot already filled with electrons emitted from the cesium oxide would be reflected back into the tube. The image dissector contained a detector of sorts that would collect these reflected electrons. By amplifying the output of the detector, a signal could be produced which corresponded to the exact image brightness of wherever the beam happened to be pointing on the surface of the image dissector. Deflect the beam in a raster pattern using electromagnetic fields from a deflection yoke, and you can scan the whole face of the dissector and generate a signal from the entire image. Here's a more practical demonstration of what's going on. This poster board represents the target of the scanning electron beam. The image we're looking to capture is a simple white circle. A lens is focusing that circle onto the face of the image dissector. The circle of light, which was a sol, by the way, will cause the cesium oxide coating to emit electrons inside the tube wherever the light touches. Will represent electrons in red. Therefore, the circle will be filled with red electrons. It should be noted here that the resemblance to the Japanese flag was entirely accidental. It took me filling in over 90% of this to realize, that's the flag of Japan. Anyway, the electron gun sits behind the cesium oxide, and it emits a string of an electron beam. Deflector magnets bend the electron beam and will start scanning the image. For the first few lines, nothing extraordinary occurs, as the electrons are just absorbed by the target. But once the beam reaches the circle, it gets deflected back because electrons are already there. In other words, where the light touches, the electrons must never go there. These deflected electrons get picked up by a collector electrode inside the tube, and by monitoring the output from this electrode, you get a signal which varies in intensity in proportion to the brightness of the spot the beam is currently scanning. So reverse the process. Here's a television receiver. Its electron beam is following along the same path as the one in the image dissector. So if the scanning beam is aimed at one spot, the electron beam in the television set will be pointed at the same spot. Whenever the dissector detects light from the circle, the signal it produces will cause the television receiver to spit electrons out from its own electron gun. This will make the phosphors inside the tube glow in the same places that the dissector detected light, and at the same relative intensity. After the scanning is complete, the television will have drawn that circle. Do that really, really fast and over again, and you've got yourself some mighty fine television. If you're confused, and I wouldn't blame you if you are, it might be helpful to check out my previous video on how analog television works. That video discusses the raster pattern, how the television synchronizes the image coherently via triggers built into the signal, and more in greater detail. Hopefully, you'll be able to see that the television camera tube is essentially the same thing as the cathode ray tube in a television set, but with the electron beam used as a way to detect the presence of light rather than to reproduce it. You can find a link to the video down below or hang around until the end screen. Farnsworth's image dissector was a big deal, but it kind of sucked. Because the beam has to move across the face of the dissector so quickly in order to produce an image, it has only the tiniest fraction of a second to actually encounter an electron on the surface and be deflected back. The cesium oxide coating wasn't super great at producing electrons from light, so television cameras that used Farnsworth's image dissector needed an insane amount of light in order to work. This meant studio lighting was absurdly bright and hot, and it generally presented unfortunate limitations. A much more practical device for producing television signals was the iconoscope. Here comes another person into the fold. Vladimir Zworykin filed patents for a television system in 1927 and 1925. If you've been paying attention, you'll have noticed that these years predate Farnsworth's patent application. I told you, this was complicated. In 1923, Zworykin presented his idea to H.P. Davis, the general manager of Westinghouse where he worked, and in 1925, he demonstrated the first prototype. However, it barely worked, and Davis wasn't impressed. So unfazed was Davis that he told Zworykin to work on something useful. Zworykin would later work for RCA. The iconoscope functioned essentially the same as the image dissector, but there was one key difference, and Zworykin wasn't the one who discovered the principle that would solve the problem. That was Hungarian engineer Kalman Tihanyi. There's way too many people here. Anyway, the big deal with the iconoscope was that it didn't rely solely on electrons emitted from the cesium oxide. Rather, it used a sheet of mica which had tiny silver particles coated with our friend cesium oxide on one side and a thin film of plain old silver on the other. The separation of these two sheets provided by the mica essentially turned the thing into a giant capacitor capable of storing electrons. When operating, the iconoscope would first send a steady sweep of electrons across the whole target. This would provide a uniform charge throughout the mica sheets. Light reflected from subjects in the studio and subsequently focused through a lens onto the target would cause the cesium oxide to emit electrons again in the spots hit with light, creating an electron copy of the image. And this would cause the charge stored between the layers to decay more rapidly than it would if no light were hitting it. The next time the target is scanned, areas that weren't hit with light will still have electrons in them, which will resist the beam's efforts to try and add more. This extra beam energy is reflected back and picked up by the detector ring. Areas that were hit with light would quickly lose their electrons, and the beam's energy would instead be used to replenish these lost electrons. The iconoscope produced an inverted signal, as dark areas reflected the beam strongly, and bright areas didn't reflect it much at all, but it was much, much, much more sensitive than Farnsworth's image dissector because it could store electrons in the mica sheet, and thus greatly increase the likelihood that the electron beam would actually be deflected back to the detector. One tricky bit about the iconoscope was that the light it was detecting and the electron beam had to hit the mica sheet from the same side. This is why the tube is such a weird shape. The electron gun can't be in the line of sight of the target, so it's tucked below the target screen at an angle. In a working camera, it's actually in front, or seen below the lens. Electronics in the camera would adjust its scanning speed as it went to compensate for the keystone shape it would naturally produce if the beam was projected as a simple square at an upwards angle. A side effect of the way the iconoscope works is an image that can never truly be black. Electrons will decay from the mica screen without any light hitting it at all. Light simply accelerates this decay. The detector ring would pick up these rogue electrons, and it would transmit as an entirely gray screen. There needed to be bright areas of the picture to pull down the average emission of the mica screen and make the other areas appear black. In other words, high contrast scenery was required. Lighting conditions would have to be accounted for to keep the averaging effect of the iconoscope from producing odd-looking images. Because this episode is a circus of who did what, let's drop one more name. The iconoscope design was immensely improved by accident in 1931, when Sandberg Essig left one of the mica plates in the oven too long. This broke up the silver layer into tiny globules, which was responsible for increasing the resolution the iconoscope could detect immensely. Therefore, a sharper image was produced. So, don't forget about him. Although the iconoscope was a great improvement over Farnsworth's image dissector, it still wasn't that great. The images were noisy, of poor resolution, and it still required a lot of light, though far less than the original dissector did. RCA would develop the image orthicon tube in the 1940s, and this much more sensitive device would be used into the 60s. The image orthicon tube combined principles of the iconoscope, image dissector, and the original orthicon tube. The orthicon tube, along with the European CPS emetron tube, contained deflector plates that, when calibrated correctly, would reduce the velocity of the scanning electrons coming from the electron gun to almost zero as they approached the target. This was immensely helpful, because without these deflectors, electrons could still bounce back into the detector ring without photoelectrons being present. This created for a noisy picture. Slowing the electrons down before they hit the target meant almost no rogue electrons would have enough gusto to make it back to the detector. Only those scanning electrons that actually encountered another electron at the target would make their way back, as the extra repelling force imparted by its photoelectric neighbor would help to push it backwards. This greatly reduced the grainy image noise associated with ordinary tubes. In addition to the electron slow downy thing, the image orthicon tube used a neat physics trick to amplify the effect of the photoelectrons and make the whole thing more sensitive. In an image orthicon tube, the surface the light falls on to make the image, called the photocathode, and the surface the electron beam scans to make the signal, called the target, are separated by a fairly great distance. The photocathode is negatively charged, meaning electrons near it will want to fly away from it, and in front of the scanning target is a wire mesh with a slight positive charge used to attract the photoelectrons. This causes the photoelectrons emitted from the photocathode to be accelerated towards the scanning target. The separation of photocathode and target causes a dramatic increase in speed of the photoelectrons, which results in a multiplication of the electrons generated from the image. This happens because when an individual electron slams into the target at high speed, it causes a splash, forcing many more electrons out of the target. This is called secondary emission, and a wire mesh behind the target with a slight positive charge traps these extra electrons. This phenomenon is used to greatly increase the tube's sensitivity. You see, the extra electrons produced when the first photoelectron hit the target came from within the target itself. Essentially, the high speed of the photoelectron knocks out a whole bunch of other electrons when it hits the target. This causes a net loss of electrons in the area of impact, giving that area of the scanning target a slight positive charge. When the scanning beam from the electron gun runs over this area, the electrons it emits are first used to refill those lost from the secondary emission events. The result is that bright areas of the picture use the beam's energy to recharge the target, and no electrons are reflected back if detected. Dark areas of the image don't displace electrons in the target, so the beam is reflected back as electrons are already there, and a strong signal is produced via the diodes and electron multiplier at the base of the tube. The image orthicon tube was a big deal for many reasons, not the least of which was that cameras could be much smaller and less awkward, as the scanning portion of the tube was no longer in front of the imaging target. But it was also sensitive enough to capture scenes lit by candlelight, and its logarithmic light sensitivity matches that of the human eye, which made images produced from these tubes appear more natural. A fun little fact immortalized by Wikipedia regarding the image orthicon tube is that it's directly responsible for the name of the award given by the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. Image orthicon tubes were often referred to informally as IMMYs. The president of the Academy at the time, Harry Lubke, wanted to name the award after the IMMY. but since the statuette is female, the more feminine Emmy was chosen. The inverted signals of the image orthicon and iconoscope, meaning bright areas produce little to no signal and dark areas produce a strong signal, wasn't the problem, as this is how television broadcasts were transmitted anyway. It was up to your TV set to flip those values around. Phew, that was complicated. And I didn't even mention Kenjiro Takayanagi's 1926 demonstration in Japan of a CRT-based television system. Sadly, he doesn't get much credit because his camera was still mechanical using a Nipkoff disc. There, I said it. Nipkoff. Or should it be Nipco, as some have suggested? I don't know. Maybe you should argue about it in the comments. There are so many dots to connect here that I'm not going to claim I got it all correct. For one thing, it's hard to pin down how developments in Europe affected those in the US and vice versa, particularly due to the patent dispute between Farnsworth and Zworykin, which made new developments dance around their respective technological claims. This is a large part of why I didn't go into much detail on European tubes and systems. And all the names given to all the tubes is very confusing for creating a research timeline in the head. I'm welcome to all comments that may set records straight, so leave them below. This video is long enough, so I'll be ending it here. Stay tuned, as in the next video, we'll be looking at the next big thing in TV. Color. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I am delighted.
It's an important time to save. With Priceline, you can get up to 60% off amazing hotels. And when you get a big deal, you feel like a big deal. Priceline. Every trip is a big deal.
At O'Reilly Auto Parts, we know how important it is for your car to look sharp and run well. And we're here to make that as simple as possible by delivering everything you need for your next project with free next-day delivery. O'Reilly Auto Parts.
How do you take an existing technological standard and make it do 3 times as much stuff, all the while without really changing it? This was the task given to RCA in developing their compatible color television system. A black and white television set need only know how bright part of an image is. The color television needs to know how much red is in an image, how much green, and how much blue. These 3 combined images will appear in full color, but any one of them on their own wouldn't look right on a black and white TV. And RCA didn't have more bandwidth at their disposal, as the standards had already been established for black and white TV. They couldn't send 3 distinct images even if they wanted to. So they needed to take the existing television signal and somehow add more information to it, and still make it compatible with existing black and white television. RCA was working towards a color television system that could do just that. They had gotten the fundamentals figured out of their compatible color system, and were competing with CBS's field sequential color wheel system for FCC approval in 1950. You can learn more about that system in the previous video. RCA's system was based on the 1938 work of Georges Valenzy of France. The National Television Systems Committee, or Ntsc, chose RCA's system as their standard, and they lobbied hard for its approval. To recap, the CBS system used a conventional black and white picture tube and camera, both of which were fitted with a spinning wheel in front of them. The wheel contained repeating sections tinted red, green, and blue. If you shoot each color sequentially and do it fast enough, persistence of vision will kick in and prevent you from noticing. Synchronize the disc between camera and receiver, and you'll get a full-color image. But to be convincing, the color wheel has to spin very fast. CBS increased the field rate from the standard 60 Hz to 144 Hz, allowing the complete RGB image to be seen 48 times per second. But in doing so, they threw out any possibility of being compatible with existing television. RCA, meanwhile, was using a new type of picture tube which contained a repeating pattern of red, green, and blue phosphor dots in front of a shadow mask, which worked in conjunction with 3 separate electron guns in the tube to simultaneously show a red, green, and blue image in one device. These groupings are not in any way discrete pixels, which I feel bears repeating from my last video. They simply serve as a regular pattern with which the shadow mask can prevent the electron guns from hitting the wrong color. This new shadow mask picture tube was the key to compatibility. If all 3 electron guns ran at the same intensity relative to each other, it would function exactly the same as an ordinary black and white television, making an image using a repeating pattern of horizontal lines. But if you control them independently, the picture tube can now make a full color image on its own, while still building the image in fundamentally the same fashion as a standard television. However, RCA's color system required a more complicated camera with 3 separate video tubes, each of which was behind a filter to provide it only with red, green, or blue light. The 3 separate image components provided by the tubes were combined and encoded in such a way that the transmitted signal appears to be a black and white transmission. A black and white TV would display a perfectly acceptable image from these transmissions, but a color television set could recover the color into luminance signals. We are much more sensitive to changes in brightness than in color, so the image would seem completely natural. In fact, many digital formats such as MPEG-2 exploit our eyes' poor color detection in a similar way, dedicating more data to brightness than color to allow for compression. Anyway, I'm really not going to elaborate further on QAM because, oh my goodness, there's a lot of math involved. But if you're intrigued, I cordially invite you to visit some links down below. But to finish our story, we started with the last video. When the FCC had given the go-ahead for the CBS color wheel system in 1950, RCA's color wasn't working too well. In fact, at the beginning of the competition, they were still pursuing a 3-tube optical system, but they were investing heavily in their replacement system using a shadow mask CRT. Regardless, the image quality for the CBS system was far superior to what RCA and others could muster at the time with their early shadow mask offerings. RCA fought very hard to get approval for their system, but it didn't come. But 2 things happened to make sure they would eventually succeed. First was the reformation of the Ntsc. The National Television Systems Committee created the original black and white television specifications, and having seen RCA's work on a compatible color system coming down the pipeline, they got back together and worked hard to try and get the FCC to approve this new system. This very much annoyed the FCC because they had already given permission to CBS to proceed. However, the Korean War threw CBS's plans under the bus. The National Production Authority declared that color television production must cease on November 20th, 1951, exactly 1 year after permission was granted to begin color broadcast. And in the meantime, the Ntsc and RCA remained hard at work improving their new compatible color system. By 1953, the shadow mask CRT was sufficiently developed and was producing excellent results. And funny enough, it was one of CBS's subsidiaries that made the first breakthrough. It became obvious that CBS's sequential color wheel system didn't make any sense whatsoever if compatible color was producing similar results. In March of 1953, CBS testified before Congress that they were abandoning their color TV efforts, after which time the ban on producing color televisions was lifted. The Ntsc restarted their efforts for FCC approval, and it was granted to them on December 17, 1953. The first nationwide color transmission of the new compatible system occurred on January 1st, 1954, a broadcast of that year's Tournament of Roses parade. In the U.S., color TV wouldn't really take off for about 10 years. Early color sets were insanely expensive, costing about as much as a new car, and their vacuum tube electronics were very finicky. These color TVs required lots of patience, though it's amazing to me that this amount of complexity could even be achieved with 1950s technology. But the fact was, most TV programming was still in black and white.
As much as a new car.
That the majority of TV broadcasts were in color. Until that point, owning a color TV was a luxury that only rarely saw its true value. It wouldn't be until 1972 that color TVs outsold black and white units in the U.S. And now, some odds and ends. Actually, later, some odds and ends. I hate to do this, but I found over 10 minutes of stuff that I want to talk about. I'm sorry, this was supposed to be only 2 parts, but it's getting longer still. In the next video, I'll touch on the differences between Ntsc and PAL. We'll go over chroma dots and color restoration, Guillermo Gonzalez Camarena's dubious invention, the 29.97 frames per second nonsense we deal with here in the States, and more. Thanks for watching, and thanks for putting up with another cliffhanger. If you like this sort of video and are new to the channel, why not subscribe? I'd also like to thank all of my Patreon supporters for keeping this channel possible, especially these folks who get their names in lights. You can support this channel and help keep these videos coming more frequently. Patreon supporters have allowed me to focus on the channel to a much greater extent. If you're interested in helping out, please check out my Patreon page through the link on your screen or down below in the description. Thank you for your consideration, and I'll see you next time.
Ooh, I like this video. It's so complicated, but yet so simple. Silver halide touches the film. Cellulose relax with oxygen and light. It helps as you stare into the camera intensely.
This is a camera. No, really. A shoebox, a piece of aluminum foil with a tiny pinprick in it, a small flap, and a bit of opaque tape for light stealing is all you technically need to create a device which can take photographs. In fact, this is one of the photos it took. I made this thing in high school photography class, and I imagine many other students started their courses in a similar fashion. So, what better way to introduce the topic of photography than with this obscure camera? Speaking of obscure cameras, the camera Obscura is an ancient device? More like a concept. An ancient imaging thing that's very old and probably was discovered accidentally many, many times before anyone thought to make use of it. Its name is Latin and means dark chamber, which should give you a decent clue about what it is.
It's a dark chamber.
It's a dark chamber, but there's a hole in it on one side. And because light travels in straight lines, if that hole is small enough, it will actually cause an image to be projected onto the surface opposite the hole. Now, we can go deep into optics junk and talk about diffraction and optimal ratios for the size of the hole or the chamber itself, but I don't want to do that. So instead, I'm going to explain it like this. Imagine you have a piece of paper in front of you with a hole in it. You can only see what's on the other side of the paper through that hole. Now, obviously, that limits what you can see. But if you move your eyes down, no, not just looking. If you move your head down, now you can see something you previously couldn't. You're able to see objects through the hole that are higher up because the angle that you're looking through the hole has changed. If you move to the left, now you can see things that are to the right of your previous view. This is probably not a shocking discovery, but here's where things get weird. If that hole is really, really small, now you basically can't see anything through it. The only thing you can see is a tiny speck of light coming from whatever is directly opposite the hole from where your eye happens to be. But the same positional phenomenon as before is still occurring. What you can see depends on the angle that you're looking through the hole. Move down and you see things higher up. Move to the left and you see things to the right. But, I hear you say, you can't see anything. You can only see a speck of light. But that speck of light will change brightness and color based on the tiny part of the whatever you can actually see through the hole. That was a confusing sentence. Okay, so you can't make anything out looking through that tiny hole. It's just too small. But the apparent brightness of the speck of light you can see is directly correlated to the brightness of whatever tiny part of an object is on the other end of a straight line between your eye and that object which intersects that hole. That's even more confusing. It's just like before. Move down and you see higher things, move to the left and you see brighter things, and vice versa. But what you're able to see is such a small part of whatever is out there that all you end up with is a point of light. The hole got smaller, so the region of space you can see got smaller too. So small, it's just a point. Now, I know what you're thinking. A point of light's not useful, is it? Can't make anything out with that. Well, that's just a problem with your eye. See, the goal isn't actually to look through the hole. Instead of an eye, you put a screen opposite the hole, then turn around so you're facing that screen. Suddenly, the screen will reveal a projected image of whatever's on the other side. From the perspective of any point on the screen, only a tiny speck of light is reaching it. But the speck of light that reached it came from just a small region of space on the other side of the hole. See what's happening? Every spot on the screen is only getting hit with light from a tiny spot out there. Once it hits the screen and reflects off of it, that allows our eyes to see an image on the screen. That image will be upside down and backwards because geometry, but still pretty neat. How is this useful? Well, back in the days of yore, you could build a light-proof box, put a tiny hole in one side of it, point it at something, then have somebody go into the box with a canvas, put the canvas opposite the hole, and use the projected image to paint an accurate, if laterally reversed, picture of a subject by simply drawing on top of the projection. The act of drawing over a projected image was called ray tracing. We'll see how well that joke ages. Anyway, before long, we grew tired of the really dim images produced by pinholes and started playing around with these lens things. We found that if you take some glass and make it all curved-like, you can make light bend as it enters and exits the glass and behave a lot like it does through a pinhole, while allowing for much more light to be collected and still form a projected image on a screen or whatever. That made the image much brighter. And before long, we started using mirrors and translucent screens to unflip and de-upside down the image for less confusing and more accurate tracing. Neat stuff. But tracing was annoying. It took some skill, was really slow, and generally was just a bummer. Plus, tracing was just the first step. If you wanted, like, shading and color, you'd need some sort of artist. Where are you going to get one of those? Photography was born as a means to eliminate the human drawing part of the camera obscura. The name photography is actually quite fitting for what it does. Its Greek roots translate to drawing with light. If we could somehow use the light itself to make a drawing, we'd save a lot of headaches. We had a pretty good idea of what needed to be invented, some sort of light-sensitive material. And boy, did lots of people take their cracks at this. One of the most well-known early photographic techniques was the Daguerreotype, named for its inventor, Louis Daguerre. This was the first photographic process to attain widespread adoption, announced to the public in 1839. Now, I'm not going deep into the history of photography here, but I will talk about this photographic process because it's chemically quite similar to the modern-day black and white process. The implementation is just a little, strike that, really wonky. Daguerre took highly polished plates of silver-coated copper and, in the dark, exposed them to iodine gas. Later, other halogens, chlorine and bromine, would also be used. This changed the very top surface of the plate's coating from pure silver to halides of silver. In the case of iodine specifically, that would be silver iodide. And at this point, the plate was now light-sensitive. These silver iodide molecules would, when hit with photons, undergo a reduction reaction and revert back to tiny bits of pure silver. If you kept that plate in the dark until it was placed in a camera obscura, then used the camera to project an image of a subject onto the plate, you now have a plate where certain parts of its surface no longer contained silver iodide, but actually contained pure silver. And of course, those transformed parts corresponded to the areas of the plate that were hit with light, and therefore captured the shape of the image chemically. A drawing was made with light itself. Thus, photography was born. However, at this point, that image would not be visible. For one thing, you couldn't expose the plate to light outside the camera until you had done some processing to it. But for another, the image formed in the exposure is hardly an image at all. This so-called latent image needed development to become visible. And in the days of the daguerreotype, that happened by exposing the plate to mercury vapor. Fun. Quick note, development didn't need to be done chemically. Some processes took the camera-exposed plate and exposed them further to light through color filters. Others would simply expose the plate in the camera for a very long time, but that had obvious limitations. From now on, we are talking about chemical development of the latent image. The development process took the exposed spots of the plate with infinitesimally small silver molecules and enlarged those molecules into merely microscopically small particles of pure silver. Now they were large enough to be visible on the parts of the plate in which they were present. The last step was to get rid of the silver iodide that had not been transformed into pure silver in a process known as fixing. Daguerre initially used a hot bath of salt water to do this, but later sodium thiosulfate was used. And at this point, the plate contained a permanent, viewable image. A photograph happened. Now, if you know anything about analog photography, you might be a little confused here, as was I. I'm used to the thing that comes out of the camera being a negative image, where areas hit with light become dark, and so the image appears inverted. Yet the very plate that was in the camera is what becomes viewed in a daguerreotype, and they are clearly positive images. Reversal film, also known as slide or positive film, unlike that of viewing any other type of photograph. The image does not sit on the surface of the plate. After flipping from positive to negative, as the viewing angle is
She's a
adjusted,
big girl
viewers
here.
experience an apparition in space, a
Oh.
mirage that arises once the eyes are properly focused. Sounds like I need to get my hands on a daguerreotype. Luckily, through the magic of buying two of them, I have one of them right here. We'll get to this guy. It's not actually a daguerreotype. This is now handily the oldest not-book object I've ever held in my hands. At least I'm pretty sure. Daguerreotypes fell out of fashion by 1860. You'll soon see why, though this is probably at least 160 years old, and literally one of a kind, which is pretty neat, I gotta say. Daguerreotypes were extremely fragile objects which could not be touched, so almost always they were mounted behind glass in cases like this. This is a 6-size daguerreotype, meaning that the same sensitized plate was divvied up and used for 6 photographs. Would you like to see it? Here it is. This is really a lovely photograph, a woman and her infant child. The Anson stamped in the border suggests that this was taken at the studios of Rufus Anson, a photographer active in New York from 1851 to 1867. So, given that this appears to be an Anson daguerreotype, it probably dates from somewhere between 1851 and 1860. For being so old, it's held up pretty well, and the image looks remarkably lifelike. It's very sharp and highly detailed. Just about the only flaw is this bit of tarnishing down here, and the fact that little baby Gertrude didn't quite keep still for the exposure. Her right hand is blurred, as is her, I'm assuming this is a girl, hairpiece? Whatever you'd call this. I'm no expert on mid-19th century baby fashion. Oh, and yes, that is almost certainly her right hand. Most daguerreotypes are mirror images because of that pesky geometry thing. Some photographers used cameras with mirrors in them to undo this, but that was uncommon as it was less clear. Since this looks so good, you might be wondering why the daguerreotype fell out of favor. Well, I have the camera positioned as perfectly as I can for you to be able to see this. If I move it even just a little bit, that happens. I had no idea daguerreotypes were like this. When you see pictures of them online, those pictures were taken as I took this shot. But you need fairly specific lighting conditions to do that because of how this is structured. And this reveals how we are getting a positive image out of the same silver halide chemistry that produces negatives like these. The image is in fact barely there. If you angle the plate to reflect something bright, you'll see that it practically disappears. And when you remind yourself how this plate was sensitized, you'll probably figure out why. Remember that this is a polished plate of silver-coated copper. The very top layer of silver was converted to silver iodide, or some concoction of other halides, to make it sensitive to light. And the areas that got hit with light then turned into silver. The image is made of the same material as its backing, but that's okay because under the right conditions, that actually makes a positive image. The plate itself is basically a mirror. If you position it so that it reflects something dark, then you end up with the unexposed parts of the plate appearing black. The areas that got hit with light, though, have impurities. It's still particles of silver, but they aren't part of the polished mirror finish anymore. They're sitting on top of what's left of the original unconverted silver. So, as long as there is some ambient light to hit them and become scattered, those parts will appear brighter than the reflection of darkness. This makes it an apparent positive, though with serious viewing limitations. Oh, and if you position it so that it reflects something very bright, well, now you see the negative image you might expect, because those impurities are now blocking the reflection and so appear darker than the background. Really, this is just rather difficult to view. In some lighting situations, it's practically impossible, but funnily enough, under these studio lighting conditions, it's really easy. But it's important to keep in mind that when these were being produced, artificial light was still coming from these things. The gas mantle hadn't even been invented yet. I have way more opportunities to make this image pop than the people in it ever did. So it's no surprise that as soon as we figured something better out, we flocked to it. And this is that. The image of this fine gentleman appears on an Ambrotype. Ambrotypes were an implementation of the wet collodion process, not to be confused with the Nick collodion process. Here, collodion, which is a syrupy alcohol and ether-based solution of nitrocellulose, is used as a carrier medium for particles of silver halides. It was much easier to produce plates this way, since they didn't require the perfectly polished surface that daguerreotypes did. After coating a plate of glass in iodized collodion, the plate was then immersed in silver nitrate, which sensitized it. Then, when it was still wet, it was placed in a camera, exposed, developed, and finally fixed. And this is the end result. Note that there's some very subtle tinting done on the face to make a blushing effect. Hand tinting was somewhat common in Ambrotypes. In this case, the effect is so subtle that I didn't notice it for days, so it's very possible that the coloring has simply faded in the century and a half since this was taken. If you look closely, you'll see that the light areas of the image appear to be floating on top of the dark areas. It's particularly noticeable at the edges of his shirt and coat, and also with the coat in the background. This was another trick to get a positive image out of a negative. The dried collodion layer that contains the image, known as the emulsion, is placed in front of something dark. This could be done by varnishing the glass, or by putting velvet behind it, or even simply by using dark glass. In this case, I believe there's velvet behind the glass. Under intense light, I can see some sort of texture in the darkness. To reveal the image, the metallic silver particles in the developed emulsion reflect and scatter ambient light, appearing a milky gray or tan, and thus brighter than the dark background they either float in front of or are on top of. Therefore, the image appears as a positive. While the image in an Ambrotype is much easier to view than a Daguerreotype, it's also much duller. To attain desirable results, the plates were underexposed, creating limited tonal range. To highlight the difference, notice how there is basically no detail to be seen in the man's forehead. Compare that to the woman in the Daguerreotype. However, given that these were so much easier to view, they quickly displaced the Daguerreotype. Then again, the Ambrotype was itself displaced quickly too, once people had figured out that glass was a waste of time. In the later tintype, the light-sensitive emulsion coats a sheet of metal which has been covered in a dark lacquer. In principle, the image is created in the exact same fashion as the Ambrotype, but because of the inexpensiveness of the plates and likely due to the greater amount of practice that allowed photographers, tin-type plates could go from being prepared for exposure to the customer's hands with their faces on them in mere minutes. This actually allowed the tintype to hang around for a long time as a sort of novelty photograph sold in places like carnivals. Think of it like an early photo booth. For those uses, it clung to life into the early 20th century, and some people are still making them today for artistic or possibly hipster reasons. However, the tintype wouldn't hang around for too long as a mainstay of photography because we had other ideas up our sleeves. Photographs made using the wet collodion process were still finicky. Up till now, becoming a photographer was a serious commitment. You need to be able to make your own plates, have all of the necessary chemicals, know how to operate a camera to make useful images out of it, have access to a dark room. Oh, and you need all this stuff with you when you took photographs because the plates, again, were wet. They needed to be prepared mere minutes before a photograph was taken. Early attempts at making dry plates resulted in very insensitive plates which were quite rude and also took way too long to expose for portraits. So the early decades of photography were limited to professionals who either had their own studios or who had built portable darkrooms and went from town to town offering their portraiture services. Luckily for them, we're all at least a bit narcissistic, so they sold like hotcakes. Oh, and hats off to this 19th century dog lover. For photography to spread to the general public, a number of things needed to happen. First, we needed to develop some type of photographic emulsion that was decently sensitive while dry. Then we'd need to find some way to use that emulsion that was more user-friendly than plates. Also, cameras needed to get smaller. As luck would have it, all those things would soon occur. George Eastman, who had started a business producing dry plates in 1880, by then we figured out how to make them decently sensitive, patented a method of depositing a light-sensitive emulsion on a flexible backing, which you might call a film, in 1884. Previously, in 1881, a man named
David Houston
had obtained a patent for a camera design which could use this roll film. I don't exactly know how the timing worked out on that one. Maybe he just theorized the possibility of roll film, but whatever. In any case, in 1888, Eastman developed a basic camera which held a long roll of this new film stuff, enough to take 100 pictures. He decided to make up a name for this camera and called it the Kodak. Yep, Kodak literally is the thing that brought photography to the masses. Eventually, Eastman would rename the entire company around this made-up word, but also still his own name. It's technically still Eastman Kodak and has been since 1892. Imagine a world in which Eastman called it the Flarble. Anyway, the original Kodak camera was a small leather-bound cardboard box with two spools inside of it. One contained a supply of film, and the other was used to pull the film through the camera as you took pictures. When you had finished taking the 100 shots on the roll, you would send the entire camera to Kodak. They would remove and develop the film and send you back prints along with your camera. Kodak developed the slogan, "You push the button, we do the rest." Prints, you say? What is a print? Well, hold your horses. We gotta talk more about this film stuff first. With the development of the Kodak camera, no longer was the object in the camera the thing that made the final photograph. Now the camera was making those negative images you might be used to seeing, and there was a second step required to turn that negative image into a viewable positive. I'm going to be covering that process in a later video on this subject, and for now we're going to get back to the film. Although the first Kodak camera wasn't designed to be opened by the user, in no small part because doing that in the daylight would ruin all of the film in the camera, Kodak moved away from this model and began selling cameras with user-replaceable film. To enable this, Kodak developed film formats which could be loaded in daylight while protecting the film itself from light. One of these early formats, 120, endures to this day as a medium format film. Introduced in 1901 for the second in their wildly successful Brownie camera line, the Brownie No. 2, very clever name, 120 format is quite simple. I mean, it's a 120-year-old design, huh? It's golden year. Anyway,
Kitty.
These shouldn't be surprising, but here's what it actually looks like.
Kitty.
It's merely a spool holding paper that's been wrapped around it a bunch of times. The paper is blackened, sometimes only on one side, to protect the film in the middle from amplification. Now, this is terrible, terrible film, so I'm willing to destroy a roll for you to see how exactly this works as a film format. As you unroll the paper, you'll see that there are markings on it. These help with loading the camera and identify when to stop
I put
unrolling.
thing up here for you to sleep on and make wet and get dirty with your piss.
Keep going though, we
Water.
get to the actual film. And there it is. A sheet of transparent plastic covered in a gelatin-based emulsion of silver halide molecules.
How's that, huh?
Absolutely useless now that we've seen it in the light. But hey,
bitch.
now you've seen what it looks like. It's simply taped to the paper backing on one end, and as the backing gets pulled through the camera, so does the film. There yet?
Oh.
Are we there yet? Well, I won't let it go yet. On the backing, you'll notice that there are a series of printed numbers. This is one of my favorite details of 120 film. To tell you which shot your camera is about to take, and thus how many you have left, many 120 cameras have little red-tinted peepholes allowing you to see these numbers. There are different sets with different spacing because, depending on the camera, different image sizes were taken. Cameras which took 6 by 6 centimeter square images could get 12 shots per roll, and they placed their window in the center. The arguably nicer 6 by 9 centimeter size only yielded 8 shots, and cameras which took those put the peephole on the left. And this is such a camera. The Agfa Sure Shot Special is quite similar to the original Brownies, and the design dates from 1932. And sure enough, its film viewing peephole is on the left. But you'll notice it has two. Ah, this camera lets you cheat. Let's talk about it, shall we? These so-called box cameras, for obvious reasons, are about as simple as it gets, and for what it's worth, the original Kodak wasn't all that different, though remember, in that camera, the film was not user reloadable. All this is a light-proof cardboard box with a film holder, film winder, a couple of viewfinders, and a very basic control panel, if you can call it that. We'll start with the controls. First, there's this lever marked shutter. Believe it or not, this controls the shutter. And on this thing, it's very basic. This front lens element shifts the focus of the camera to infinity and can be slid out of the way for a closer 5 to 10 foot focus range, ideal for portraits. Behind it is the actual shutter, a simple slide-in cover with a hole in its center that's spring-loaded and blocks light from entering the camera. When you slide the lever over, spring tension builds until you cross a threshold and a photo was just taken. If there was film in there, of course. The shutter opens when you slide this across in either direction, letting light into the camera as its hole passes over the lens, and the exposure time is about 1/50th of a second. Skipping over the thing marked diaphragm, let's look at the time lever. No, it's not a time machine. When you pull this out, a little metal stopper moves in the shutter's path. This, with the help of a little nub on the shutter, holds it open if you want to try and take low light shots. It's up to you to figure out how you're going to keep this steady. Oh, but you could also use this with a flash if you opened the shutter, activated the flash bulb, then closed it. And yes, when this thing was made, flash lamps were just becoming available, but nothing was stopping you from using one of them old-timey stick things with some flash powder. And then the diaphragm. This gives you 3 delightful options. When pushed in all the way, there is no additional restriction to the diaphragm, and you get an aperture of approximately f13. That's a geometric ratio based on the size of the opening and the lens's focal length, which we don't need to get into the weeds of right now, but the number describes how much light makes it through. Smaller numbers is actually more light. Anyway, pull this out to the first click and you'll see it's marked filter. And no, it's not for Instagram. In this position, there's a yellow tinted filter placed in front of the lens. Now, if you're wondering why you would want that, well, keep in mind that this thing was taking black and white photos when it first came out, and a yellow filter lessens the amount of blue light that hits the film. This can make the sky look more vivid by darkening the blue and thus making clouds pop, or simply give more natural images with early films that were more sensitive to blue than other colors. Then, if you pull this all the way out, a second restriction finds its way behind the first, reducing the size of the aperture down to approximately f22. Alright, so let's actually put this camera to use and take some pictures. To load it with film, you simply unclip the back to open it, pull out the winding key from the body to release the film holder, and then the entire film holder assembly slides out. The main lens of the camera is right here. I'm not sure what its focal length is, but it's a simple meniscus lens, nothing fancy. Now notice that there's an empty spool up here at the top. With 120 film and other roll film formats like it, you need an empty spool to roll the film onto as it's taken. When you're done shooting, you don't rewind the film, instead you keep winding until it's all on that second spool. Then when you open the camera, you seal the completed roll. I'll show you that when we get there. And you move the now empty lower spool up to the top where it becomes the take-up spool for your next roll of film. Before we load it though, we need to decide if we want to cheat. Normally this camera takes 6:9 negatives, but these flaps here can be moved to block a quarter of the frame on each end. That allows you to take 15 or 16 if you're lucky, 6x4.5 centimeter pictures on a roll. And that's why it has 2 film peepholes. You can see here in the instructions how they're meant to be used. If shooting full-size pictures, only use the lower peephole. If you're shooting half frames, shoot A first, then move the same number up to window B. Pretty clever, though I don't understand why they wouldn't have just put a window on the right to show the closely spaced frame numbers on the film backing. Perhaps they thought that was too confusing, or maybe at that time those numbers weren't there. I don't know, but that's why you might only get 15 shots. Technically, if you position frame 8 up here, you might be past the edge of the film already. Oh, and I should mention, this is calling it B2 film because of the AGFA connection. In Germany, 120 film was called B2 for reasons. So, for this roll, I'll shoot the full frame. Making sure the flaps are retracted and locked like any good pilot. I'll get a fresh roll of film. I'll still use this terrible stuff because I've got a lot of experience. I'll take it out of the seal, observe a bit of masking tape holding it tight with the roll, and simply place it here in the void space below the lens. It snaps right in. Now I'll carefully pull this around the back, over these rollers, and up to the top, all the while pushing on the supply roll to make sure it doesn't fall out. Also, you can just rest this on a table, that works too. This is always a little bit fiddly. Sometimes it makes sense to remove the take-up spool and start threading it a bit. You could also use tape, sometimes even the tape that sealed the roll, to affix it to the take-up spool. Good news is there's lots of backing paper. Anyway, once you're sure it's not going to slip off the spool, you can then carefully put the carrier back in the camera, push in the winding key, and start turning it. Technically, I could close the camera at this point, but I'll keep turning it until I see the index arrow appear. Now I'll close it up and the camera is ready for use. Well, almost. Now we need to wind the film while looking through that little peephole. Remember, we're shooting the full frame, so we can ignore the top window B. As I keep winding, eventually those warning marks will appear telling me to slow down. And then, once the number 1 is visible in that window, the first frame of film is in place and ready to be exposed. A while back, I mentioned that there were a pair of viewfinders. Well, that's what these two lenses are for. On the top and side of the camera are simple viewing windows. You don't hold these up to your eye. Instead, you hold the camera at about your stomach level and look down at them. You'll notice that there are little frame lines for composing the half frames this camera can take as well. Otherwise, the entire area represents the image to be taken. And of course, having 2 of them is not only magical, but also allows you to compose in either landscape or portrait orientations. So, let's take some pictures. To give you an idea of how this goes, I've set up a simple still life. I've brought my camping stove and a tea kettle as subjects. Hang on, I just gotta light the stove and put the kettle on to get ready. While we're waiting for that, remember that the film is already in place for the first shot. We can double check through the window. Now let's get ready and compose our shot. We're using the whole film frame, remember, so we can ignore those lines in the viewfinder. Okay, now that the water's boiling, make sure the time doohickey is pushed in. I'm actually going to pull the diaphragm out all the way to f22 since this is in direct sunlight. Oh, and also I'll be holding the front element out of the way since this is relatively close up. But now, just hold the camera as steady as you can, flip the shutter lever over, and there we go. On the film, we now have a latent image of vaporization. And now we can take the next picture. However, with these early cameras, there is nothing stopping you from taking a second exposure on the same frame of film. This little shutter mechanism will work every time you flip the lever, so you've got to remember to advance the film on your own. Unless you deliberately want a double exposure, but you probably don't. So, you turn the winding key until frame 2 appears in that lower peephole. Remember, we should stop it when we see 1 in the top window if and only if we're shooting half frames. Since we're not, just keep on going. And there we go, ready to take another picture. Rinse and repeat. That is until frame 8. Once you've taken that, you're out of film, and it's time to unload the camera. Before you open it, you have to wind and wind and wind with the key. There's just about as much paper on the trailing end as there was on the leading end to protect the film from light, so just keep on going. Eventually, you'll see the paper end through the little window. Sometimes it's a lot easier if the backing is white. But you're still not done. Just keep turning. You'll probably hear the paper slip past the rollers, and eventually you'll know you're just spinning the roll around. It also gets easier. Once you're there, you can pull out the winding key, open the back, remove the film holder, and there it is, your exposed film. Remove it, and there will be some sort of seal that you can either peel or perhaps moisten with your tongue or other wet object of the tongue is traditional. And once sealed, successfully use the camera. But now what? Well, this film needs to be developed, and it will be done using pretty much the same process that Daguerre was using, except with different chemicals. Turns out mercury vapor is bad for you.
Look at the cute bubbles.
And I'm going to
Look at the cute bubbles.
But not in this video. We've spent quite a long time on this subject, and I think this is a good cliffhanger. Did I say cliffhanger? I meant stopping point. In the next video, we'll explore the modern black and white development process. It's actually very, very simple, and just about anyone can do it with minimal equipment. All you really need is one of these and a completely dark room. Dark room.
We're just having a good old Rehoboam, huh? Just having a good old Rehoboam.
You can also use one of these, a changing bag. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It's time to cut the black. No, really. A shoebox, a piece of aluminum foil with a... How many words did what that?
My titty is a nigga. Why? Because he's dead.
12 words
Or
in.
no, he's Negro.
One of the most well-known early photographic techniques was the Daguerreotype, named for its inventor, Louis Daguerre. But I hear you say, you can't see anything. You have to be moving. The words need to be moving, otherwise it doesn't work. Some processes took the last step was to get rid of the silver iodide that hadn't been transformed into You monster. You missed a D. The last step was to get rid of the silver iodide that hadn't been transformed into pure C. Transformed is a word that suddenly I can't say correctly. Remarkably lifelike. Just about I skipped the sentence, which sensitized it. Then it was placed in... Whoops. Think of it like an early photo booth. To those... So, the early decades of photography were limited to professionals. Sometimes words are hard. I skipped the word cardboard, and I feel like that's important. With the development of the Kodak... darkening the blue helps make... You gotta read the words, man. You can't skip it.
What is this, asshole? Damn, Mr. F. Oh. Oh, Mr. Asshole. Come here. Come here. Ah. Oh, look how pretty you look. Oh, look how pretty you look. Oh. This looks for Methuselah honeysuckle, huh? That's my Methuselah honeysuckle, huh? Look at the pretty girl here. Oh, look at the pretty girl and the pretty boy. Matching. Get him. That baby cat's the guy who's balling out, homie.
Start selling online with Shopify, the e-commerce platform that's trusted by millions of businesses worldwide.
They're just gonna
Build your
everything
online
they have
store
anyway.
without any coding or design experience.
Hello and welcome to No Effort November, a series of videos for the month of November in which I repeatedly commit to the notion of simpler videos that swiftly fail spectacularly. It's a bit of a tradition around here, and we're mixing things up by including a segment in an ongoing series. How novel! You're right, there's no reason to have made this introduction, but too bad, I already did. Again, it's traditional. So, I just made a video about the origins and early days of photography. If you haven't seen it, there's a clicky thing, and links are everywhere else too. We were using this old camera, took some pictures, and finally unlocked going to do in this video. By the way, apparently I need to clarify that the 120 film format is still very much in production. In fact, here is some brand new film I have in both color and black and white. So destroying this roll wasn't hurting anything precious. Also, it's not that I find 120 film to be a terrible format. It's just that this batch of this particular film stock I bought on eBay a decade ago absolutely is, so ruining a roll left me with no hard feelings. I have no experience with this brand's current production, and from what I've absorbed in comments, it's probably better these days. But anyway, we are going to be subjecting this roll of film to a surprisingly similar, though heavily refined, chemical process to Daguerre's original method. First, though, it's important that we understand what this and other modern film emulsion, that's the light-sensitive layer, actually is. You may have heard the term grain before, possibly from me back when I made that video on why old movies are HD and analog video isn't. The gelatin-based emulsion carries a whole bunch of light-sensitive silver halide crystals within it, like a soup, but very congealed. Those crystals literally are the grain, and will eventually form the final image after development. But right now, they are still almost entirely as they were before the exposure even happened. See, when it was exposed in the camera, the parts of the emulsion that were hit with light did undergo reduction reactions. That's what happens when silver halides get hit with photons, but not in great amounts. In fact, the exposure to light when an image is taken hardly changes the film at all on a chemical level. Only tiny, tiny bits of the silver halide crystals, literally just a few molecules here and there, were reduced to pure silver in the exposure. That is why the image captured on the film right now is called the latent image. It's chemically there, but not visible yet. Although it's not much, the individual halide crystals that were hit with sufficient light now have what you might call a seed of pure silver within them. And a chemical developer will use that seed as a catalyst of sorts and convert the entire crystal and any others that have that silver seed into pure silver, which will make it visible. In a somewhat weird way, black and white film is sort of a random distribution of physical 1-bit pixels. Yeah, that's kind of a stretch, and might sound weird coming from me, given that I made a video on why phosphor dots in color CRTs are decidedly not pixels. But because of how the grain interacts with the developer, whether or not you can see an individual grain in the end is more or less down to whether or not it got hit with light in the exposure. When stepping back and looking at the whole image, the density of the crystals, and thus the apparent darkness, is affected by how much light hit that spot of the film. Dark areas got hit with a lot of light, so most of the grains become activated and developed, whereas light areas had few grains get hit, so only a few show up here and there. This is, by the way,